Yes, I think it would be good to start slowly and to welcome our all ladies and gentlemen waiting here and looking forward to our Somali Day and event. So allow me to welcome you all. Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning as well. Welcome to our Somali Day. Culture and politics through the lens of Somali literature and orature. Thank you for being here, for being so numerous, particularly despite all the difficulties that we have all faced since last year. So it's a great success and pleasure to have you here today, despite virtually. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Anna Chiara Raya. I teach African oral and written literature at Leiden University since 2019, and I'm currently conducting a research on vernacular print culture networks in the 20th century Indian Ocean. It's a great pleasure to have organized this event with my colleague, Professor Jan Abing, and the whole library of the African Studies Center, with whom great synergies have been created. The idea of this event, let me give you just a few coordinates and background information. The idea of this event goes back to African 2020, an initiative funded and sponsored by LeidenASA and the African Studies Center, during which we wanted to reflect on a particular year, 1960, referred to as well Year of Africa, right? Because of the developments during that year, where increasing Pan-African sentiments have spread, a peak of independence movement too, and also growing, if you want, post-colonial violence. We do all know that roughly 17 African nations became independent, right? So several initiatives were offered last year, among which the International Conference, Africa North. And we as a team, together, particularly with Gerard van Brunners, Jos Daman and myself, we decided to reflect and create a forum for discussion on this important region of the Horn, Somalia. As you know, praised very much by its oral literature marked by the civil war, and also uncovered and voiced by, if you want, the diaspora, and also quite a lot of covered research that has been conducted in the region and outside the region. Another important event that has shaped the making of this event today has been the acquisition trip in 2019, funded by the African Studies Center Library. During that acquisition trip, Gerard van Brunners purchased an amazing amount of Somali text in occasion of the 12th ASCL International Book Fair. After that important acquisition, the African Studies Center Library staff members have been very active in order to make those sources and those books visible and accessible to a wider audience. So this is how a web dossier on Somali literature has been produced, and also an online catalog has been compiled and now available to all of you. Probably my colleagues will be so kind to also share the links of these deliverables. In any case, my compliments to all of you, Jos Daman, Gerard van Brunners, Ursula Obes, Yasmin Noah, for all that you managed to create and the great work you have conducted so far. Despite that, I'm also very grateful and honored to have today here great speakers. And great speakers means great scholars and intellectuals on Somali language and literature. I'm particularly talking about Professor Ali Jimal Ahmed from CUNY University. Professor Ali, thank you for being here today. I'm referring to Professor Martin Owen from University of Naples L'Orientale. Welcome. And Jama Muse Jama from the Agasia Cultural Center in Somaliland. It's a great pleasure having you all here today. And we do very much look forward to hearing from you and to learn more. I'll briefly probably now pass the digital floor to Jan Abing, my colleague, before opening panel 1 that will see myself as chair. Thank you once again, feel at home and enjoy the event.
Yeah, thank you, Anna Chiara. It's a good introduction. I don't have much to add. It's really gratifying to see, you know, these people like Professor Ali Jamale, Dr. Jama, and Professor Martin Orwin being with us and you know, treating these fascinating aspects of Somali expressive culture. It's a nice program covering these 3 important fields of literature, both inside and outside Somalia and the diaspora, of music and of poetry. And it brings to the fore Somalia, not always, as we know in the press, as a problem spot of political turmoil and so forth, or violence, but looks at the underlying streams of cultural richness and cultural performance, which the Somali people also have since time immemorial. And these 3 genres will be discussed and presented in probably a very fascinating way by our guests. You know, if you look at the program, it's a very interesting, well composed. It's a hybrid in the sense that it's a combination of rich content in the first part, to be chaired by Anna Chiara, as well as the second panel on the networks and on the, let's say, on cultural retrieval activities by Dr. Jama. It's very fascinating, the Soundscape project, and also the way we have been collecting at the library all these materials from Somalia firsthand. So it's a fascinating program. I hope it will inspire all of you to be informed and to be enriched by the presentations, as well as generating interest in this amazing Somali expressive culture. And then I think we just should start. One thing is that in the first panel, we have 3 presenters, Professor Ali Jamal Ahmed, then Professor Martin Orwin, and then we moved the keynote lecture by Dr. Jama to this session. So we present them one after the other, and then after the 3rd lecture by Dr. Jama, we have the question and answer time. So, and the panel 2 will then be, with maybe a bit more time, devoted to the digital exhibits curated by Jos Damen, Gerard van der Bruinhorst, and colleagues, as well as by the one by Professor Ali Jamal Ahmed on Somali books and publishing overseas. So, it's a great program. I hope you enjoy it. And then I give the floor to Anna Chiara for introducing the first panel.
Thank you all once again. Yes, so we can certainly start, and it's with great pleasure and honor that now I'll give the digital floor to Professor Ali Jamal Ahmed, current professor and former chair of comparative literature at Queens College of the City University of New York. Professor Ali Jamal Ahmed will give his talk on culture and politics through the lens of Somali literature, and we are very much excited to hear from you, Professor. Welcome.
Many thanks, Professor Anna Chiara. Let me first, actually and foremost, thank the organizers of this well-conceived and well-executed event, really. Professor Anna Chiara Raya and Professor Jan Abing, and the rest of really the crew who are always behind the scenes. I also thank my co-panelists. It's an honor really to share with you guys and this digital platform. And the title of my lecture, of my talk, I should say, is Culture and Politics Through the Lens of Somali Literature. I have actually for some time now been talking about the need to differentiate between 2 forms of discourses. What I call discourses of the state and discourses of the nation. And the title and format of this event, in a way, intentionally or unintentionally perhaps, speaks to the importance of these two discourses. It's held on June the 29th and not June on the 26th or July 1st. And that in itself really focuses on what I call discourses of the nation. Now, my talk is divided into three parts. Part one is meant to unpack terms and establish a frame of reference that will at least give you where I intend to take you, basically. Of course, I engage with the texts, as Professor Ana Chiara talked about, both in terms of oral and written. And for me, the operative word here is text. And text, as the etymology of the word itself denotes, is texere, which literally means to weave. And to weave them, we are talking about both oral, orature, and written, in which case we are sort of really spinning a yarn, as they say. That, after all, talking about and explaining and interpreting both oral and written literatures, that, after all, is what literary criticism is all about. But I would also really be talking about some kind of, in a way, in passing perhaps, some critical or cultural theory which will allow me to take stock of and account for the choice of tools in my toolbox. Critical theory for me is the set of intellectual assumptions on which we base our explications and exegesis of the literary text in order to understand and interpret the ideological, rhetorical, or aesthetic foundations of the text. That would be part one. In part two, I will examine two novels, one written in Somali and one written in English. And in part three, I will focus on two Somali oral narratives. Now, literature, Sudan in the case of Somali, but literature as a whole, as a gateway or entrance into other people's lives, allows the reader to reflect on the existential and experiential quotidian of fictive characters, trying to make sense of life's vagaries and vicissitudes. The Somalis say, and this is really important, they say, sheekadu waxay buuxisaa ama kabtaa baahi jirta ama jiri karta, meaning narrative fiction covers or completes a need, a lack, real or imagined. And in the stories that I'm going to talk about, both written and oral, that is what they try to accomplish. Now, through imaginative literature then, writers and storytellers are able to sift through the rubble of life and offer, or at least point to, solutions to existential and etymological problems. But that said then, in terms of unpacking the terms, in the course of my talk, whenever I talk about, I mention culture. Culture for me is meant the way of life of a community, which encompasses its values, knowledge about itself, and how that knowledge is described, mythologized, allegorized, and prescribed in discursive modes developed over time. Culture in that sense then connotes the articulation and crystallization of tradition, custom, and belief systems of a community, which are in turn preserved and disseminated through chronicle and ritual. Now, the other term that I need to unpack early on so that you know where I'm taking you is politics. And here, politics for me, and I quote from Joseph Buchanan's definition of politics, which I really like. And here, politics, he says, is a struggle about people's imaginations. It's a struggle about people's imaginations. Of course, as the American anthropologist, the late Gertz, would sort of really say, politics also is over some sort of the struggle, basically over the meaning of symbols and institutions, and who controls those institutions, because in the final analysis, those institutions are the ones that will articulate the sort of social values a society will have. And this is what I find also in Somali literature. But the stories that I'm going to talk about also really go beyond this struggle about people's imaginations. It sort of really says we have to rethink our understanding of politics as the art of the possible. Rather, we should see politics as a challenge that turns expedience and caution on their head. This becomes all the more important when we think of how and why institutionalized forms of Somali Nimo, for example, as reflected in the extant forms available, lacked a sacred space from whose bosom, I should say, all claimants to the concept could equally and fairly relate to. Here, I will give just one quick example from the poetry of one of the leading poets in English and a leading scholar, really, Professor Muhammad Eno. And Professor Eno is now the executive president of one of the premier universities in Somalia, University of Southern Somalia, which is in Baidoa. Here, he wrote a rejoinder to a poem of mine. And in that poem of mine, which was called The Clan, the Nation, and the World, the last line, I sort of really, I said, Isudume, molder of nations, where are you now? That's what I basically said. And in his book, Corpuses on the Menu, a graphic title, indeed, in his book, he sort of really throws the question back at me. And he says, quote, in his poem, who dare assure me of equality based on morality without ethnicity, he says, unquote. In other words, who would guarantee me of a fair deal when your molder of nations appears on the political scene? And with that poignant question, Dr. Eno astutely chooses historical discontinuity to show his concern for the Somali future. And that also is what the stories I'm going to talk about, both written and oral, really do. But there is one thing, and I've mentioned this elsewhere, Somali poetry always addresses itself to the nation. And if anyone is really interested in this, or if we have time, I will talk about this later on. But now, the stories that we are going to talk about later on, poets, storytellers, writers, they create or at least contribute to the formation of a socio-cultural space where social, national life and literature intersect. The civic place, though, is not a neutral ground, but rather a space fraught with all kinds of contradictions. All narratives, as you will see in the course of my talk, have their matrix in the womb of a contradiction. Now, the two novels that I want to talk about basically, as I said before, is one written by Abdulatif Higa in English called Guban. And the other is written by a Somali Australian Ali Muhammad Dini, and it's called Walihi Warsame, the times of Warsame, the character. Now, Guban, basically, I don't really want to give away the plots of the two books, but in a nutshell, Guban is about the Civil War to a certain extent, but it also predates. It talks about almost, it starts in the early 80s, when for anyone who could really understand what was going on in Somalia, that they could see the disintegration, at least the nation coming apart at the seams. And here in this book, he starts with a flashback of a young girl, 8 years old, in the plains of Guban, in however you, in northern Somalia or in Somaliland. So in that place, this kid now reflects, reminisces. She's in Mogadishu now, but she's really in a flashback going back to when she was 8 years old. And here at this moment, there were certain anomalies in the story in the sense of Somali culture. This is a young woman, a girl, 8 years old, who always really is called the bearer of water. She is the one who goes to the water well, takes the camel with her, and brings the water. This is really strange. One, because it's men most of the times, but here you have an 8-year-old girl, and she's reminiscing this. And there is a reason for that sort of reminiscence in her case. She is now in Mogadishu, her husband is in prison, and she seeks solace in that sort of story. Literally, the story then, the remembrance, makes her persevere. Of course, the story, there are two protagonists, this one called Hugsade, the other is called Al-Dere, who's a colonel in the army. And there is this fierce sort of battle. Of course, Hugsade, Tusma's husband, escapes and joins the armed opposition groups in Ethiopia. Later on, the opposition groups defeat the national army. And at that moment, and this is the interesting thing about this story, what happens is now Hugsade, the former prisoner, confronts his prisoner, the one who imprisoned him, basically Ali Dere. And now, of course, the militias, the citizens of the city are all calling for blood. And Hugsade, the former prisoner, says, no, we have to stop this idea of vendetta. It has to stop now. And he says, you are not going to lynch him. And he sends him to the high command. And therein lies the beauty of the story. A new beginning after all, in the sense of not really going back to the idea of vendetta and lex talionis, if you will. But there is also a character in this story, a woman named Asha. And Asha belongs to the ruling, whatever that means, to the ruling clan. And what she does, though, is she's the one who helps Tusma, that young girl who's now a wife in Mogadishu and a mother. She helps her to escape from the government and join her husband in Ethiopia. And therein lies the beauty of this story. Why? Because think about the clan cultural inscription on the Somali subject cannot be underestimated. It's equally impossible or unwise to downplay the redemptive powers of an individual consciousness. And in the course of my talk, consciousness and imagination really become important. Ege conceptualizes clan reification differently by applying a kind of transformative labor that contextualizes the corporate kin system without reifying it. All reification, writes Adorno from the Frankfurt School, all reification, Adorno says, is a forgetting. And that, I sort of, because I won't have really much time to talk about all of these things. So now I'll go to the next novel, the second novel, which is written in Somali by Ali Mohammed Dini, who now lives in Australia. In this book, it's also talking about the war, but it is post-disintegration Somali. And the two books, really, they belong to an era of what I call, by borrowing it from Italian culture, the anni di piombo. Anna Chiara would know. Yeah, the years of lead. Sanadihi qiqa barud in Somali. The years of lead. And in the case of Italy, as you know, for almost 15 years, think about it, from 1969 to almost 84, there were all these kind of groups fighting among themselves in Italy, in civic places, the Red Brigade, the fascists, etc., 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 whatever, however you want to describe them. And these two books for me really talk about Sanadihi Barud, the anni di piombo. Now, in the case of this book then, here you have a kid, a young man, I should say, who lives in Galkayo in central Somalia. He is a nomad, but he wants to pursue education. He wants to learn, go to school, and he comes to Galkayo at one point. He starts working in a restaurant, but in the meantime, he wants to go to school. But before that, he also joins a Sufi sodality in Galkayo. And the Sufi sheikh is against all forms of modern education. So the kid is now in trouble, that you can't really go to school, he says, if you are with me. And slowly, Warsame, the protagonist, comes to Mogadishu. And in Mogadishu now, he also really joins, however you define it, the armed struggle, the mujahideen, however you describe it, I leave it to you basically. But he joins a school, and later on he becomes one of the important members of the armed struggle, especially when Ethiopia invades Somalia. He is wounded, he's taken to Kenya, and in Kenya, of course, he has become disillusioned with how things were run, especially in terms of the leadership of the armed groups here. What does he do? Early on, he was forced to marry, while he was in Mogadishu, a young woman who was abducted from her parents in Afghanistan. And the interesting thing here is, here you have this young man, he's forced to marry this woman, and the woman, of course, is being abducted. And he says, "You're not my wife. Don't worry about me. Don't fear me. I'm not going to do anything to you. In fact," he says, "I'll take you back to your family." And he does. And in the process, because she was betrothed to her cousin in Nairobi, she goes to Nairobi. In the meantime, of course, the two meet in Nairobi. And Warsame falls in love with a young college student. And they fall in love, but her parents are his employers, and they are not really amused with it. And they say no. In the meantime, of course, they elope, and she becomes pregnant. And unbeknownst to him early on, she really gives birth to a son. Now, she wants to go to Europe, and the fate that always awaits Somalis and Africans who try to sort of cross the Mediterranean, she perishes in that place. He, Warsame, in the meantime, goes to Australia. But he's helped by the young woman he helped, the young woman from Afghanistan, whose name is Faiza. And in that sense, then, the story really ends, or I should say both stories actually, end on a note of optimism. They formulate a new way of looking at things. They show compassion, they show empathy. Both protagonists refuse to harbor any form of grudge towards their nemesis. Both stories force the reader, compel the reader to interrogate the interstices between lives lived and lives imagined. Thus, I posit the interstices between literature and politics point to spaces that are conceptual, yet spaces that are dynamic, dialectical, and relational. Both stories then, as I said before, of course, start with flashbacks. And that in itself is really important because that flashback is something that gives them solace. Warsame, for example, in Australia, laments that his past life has not really prepared him for a productive, meaningful life in his new place. The narratives then, the narrative content and form of both novels mimic what I call a consciousness in turmoil. And this is what you find in Somali stories. The characters carry a conversation with themselves. Clarity, after all, comes at the end. Both stories, as I said before, end on a note of optimism as they point to a new way of looking at things. The protagonists, as I said before, really do in fact refuse to harbor grudge. Now, I end my talk here in terms of the written books. So now I'll go to Anna Chiara. Do I have a few minutes?
Just really two minutes left, Professor Ali. Will you manage? Of course you will.
I'll just then, what I'll do is, in the sense of the oral narratives, there is a story that I heard from my father a long time ago, which is called Ali the Honest. And here you have this kid, and I'll be talking about it actually, Anna Chiara, the translated extract that I translated from my novel comes from that story, but I appropriate it. It's no longer the same story that my father told me. And in that story, it becomes important to really remember. Here you have an orphan, the father marries another woman, and in the process, the idea, the cruelty, the universal sort of story of the stepmother. But his mother left him a she-horse, and that she-horse could sort of really predict things. And every time that his stepmother wanted to get rid of him, it was the she-horse that would always come to his rescue. And in that story, then, I think it sort of really becomes important. Of course, the universality of the stepmother, until the stepmothers tell their own stories, is always problematic, because you look even in the case of Cinderella, who will always go to her mother's tomb when she is in distress. Ali, in the case of the Somali story, goes to the she-horse that was left to him by his mother. All in all, what you really find is a society, after all, does not set a task for itself, unless there is a need for that task. And in that sense, I conclude on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ali Jumale Ahmed. It was fascinating. I really liked the way you were unpacking for us normal human beings important concepts, and I like the way you did. I'm sure there are several questions and curiosities that the audience would like to pose you. I just beg all of them to keep those on the side for now. So we will move further to our next speaker, and we will collect all the questions later on during our Q&A section. Thank you for now. Thank you and congratulations. So now I'll pass it over to Martin Owen, Professor of Somali Language and Literature at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. From literature, we will move to music. And yes, I give the digital floor to Martin Owen for a talk on Somali music from command to keyboard. And thank you, Martin. Welcome.
Right. Thank you, Anna Chiara. I should just say to everyone, please excuse me if I disappear or something. I'm afraid my internet connection is not the most stable at the moment, and it has cut out a couple of times today already. So please excuse me if that happens. Hopefully it won't, but just in case. Right, well, thank you very much, Anna Chiara, and thank you everyone for attending. Aliou and Jama, yani Salandi Rani Guduma, and Kofkasta and Bashirio in Dankale. So, Marka, sorry, I've Greece Banco Harley Dona. So I'll speak in English, and we'll be talking today about Somali music. To a large extent, I'm going to let the music speak for itself. And really, as I mean, the musical culture of any society is a very large topic to cover. And music goes hand in hand with poetry in Somali society. And so it's inevitably going to be just a sort of a very brief overview. There are one or two things I do need to make clear first of all, though, and I'm just going to share the screen now. I shall share the whole screen with the sound. Good. So, so here I've got the PowerPoint. Sorry, I should put this up. That's me, and I think some of you have seen the abstract of the tour. So I'm just going to quickly turn to Google Maps just so that you can see what we're talking about. So we have the Eastern Horn of Africa, and the Somalis live in the whole of the Eastern Horn of Africa. So Somalia and the self-declared Republic of Somaliland, which is here, which is not marked, it's not a recognized country internationally. This whole large part of Eastern Ethiopia here is inhabited by Somalis, Southeastern Djibouti and Northeastern Kenya. The culture that I'm particularly talking about is the culture that expresses itself in a variety of Somali called Afmahatiri, which differs from another major variety called Afmai. And you can see on the maps here that in the southern central regions where it's greener, in this region, this is where Afmai is spoken. And the poetic culture there and the musical culture does differ to a certain extent traditionally from the culture in the surrounding areas, which have traditionally been mostly nomadic pastoralists in the drier areas. And it's that culture of the nomadic pastoralists as expressed in Mahati that I'm going to talk about, and then the culture that became in a sense, the mainstream Somali culture in Mogadishu, which has influences from certainly the musical cultures in the southern central regions, as well as from the north and from Ethiopia and so on. So to go back to the PowerPoint. Now, the other thing that we must bear in mind when we're talking about Somali poetry is that it is heard poetry. This is why it goes hand in hand with music. We're used in the West to thinking of poetry as a written form, and certainly writing is now used for Somali poetry to make it, but it is heard. So cassettes, for example, were very important in the 1970s into the 80s. In fact, Ali has written about this in his book, Daybreak is Near. And there are Jama, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that from Jama's talk, who has a large in Hargeisa of cassettes. Nowadays, of course, it's the internet, and YouTube is full of Somali poetry and Somali music, and there are dedicated websites. I just took literally just this morning, this is I took a screenshot of one of the large music websites that Masoul.com, in which there's a lot of songs that sort of, I don't quite know how it all works technically, but there's very many songs. Another aspect of these is also a lot of these have the lyrics written to them on this website and also on YouTube. This is I've noticed a more recent phenomenon. So all of this music and poetry is there, but where does it stem from? Some of the, if we think of music in Somali society prior to the 1940s, we're talking purely of vocal music. And I'm just going to play a couple of examples of music which is from modes in which work songs are performed. So this is a work song that for camels at a second watering. This is actually performed by Hassan Ilmi. So I could have given the details. So Hassan Ilmi was a famous poet. He sadly died a few years ago. But I'm just going to play this so you get a sense of how this.
alla suntii hoysahay qaado sararaha biyeeye waybe alla si waliba jirtaaye
Right, okay, sorry, it cut out when I moved the right, so there's this particular melody. This is one of the melodies that goes with this type of work song. There are other melodies which actually go with this same pattern. But this is all, you notice there are certain words in blue. These are the words that are the alliterating words. All Somali poetry, whether it's the lyrics for a song or whether it's poetry that's made to be simply recited, is all metrical and it's all alliterating. So this is just the first 4 lines of a modern song. Now this is a traditional sort of camel watering song. This is a modern song, which you will hear sounds very different, but the actual technical characteristics of the words as poetry are the same, although the metrical pattern is slightly different. It's slightly longer. So it has a metrical pattern that's called chiefto. And the basic pattern of chiefto is la 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 la. So it's ubah qor asuslo, darab subah di qoyo, kanso nur leo, qorahso bahaysai. So the poet, which is Abdullah Hassan Guinea, who is the well-known and is the son of a very, very well-known poet, Hassan Guinea, made these words to follow this metrical pattern, and he chose the sound qa, so qor, qoy, qansoyin, and qorrah, as the alliterating sound. You have the translation in English. It's actually, this whole first 4 lines is a single vocative phrase. So the I right at the end of line 4 is like the equivalent of O. It actually should really be just O without the H in English. It's not so O, flower with a neck of red, which the dew in the morning moistens, and bows of light and sun which has come out. So it's a single noun phrase. It's made of 3 separate noun phrases, the first 2 lines and the last 2 lines. But this sounds very different. And this is an example of modern music, which I'm going to, in a sense, gradually get to in the rest of this talk. But let's just hear what this sounds like.
qor xasuuslo darab subaxdii qooyo qaasooyin nuurliyo qorax soo baxaysa ubax qor xasuuslo darab subaxdii qooyo qaasooyin nuurliyo qorax soo baxaysa
But just to make the point that the words and the shape of the words is similar to the Hestegela in many respects as poetry, as lyrics. In Somali, the distinction between a poem and a song is not. There's not an absolute sort of analog in Somali. Of course, it's a totally different language. There are many terms for different types of poems, but I won't go into all of the details of that at the moment. I have given some of the technical details for the music, if there are any musicologists here. So it's all pentatonic. This is a minor pentatonic scale in this, and that's actually reflective of some of the forms of traditional sort of musical structure. I'm just going to return now to another traditional work song, which is one that women perform when they're making these mats. You can see in this photograph, this is what's called akal. I actually did see this very akal. It was some years ago in the early 2000s, and it was between Hargeisa and Borama in the west. We were driving to Borama, and then somebody else had taken a photo of it, and it was actually published in this book, Somaliland, un pays plein de promesses, which was published in Djibouti. But when the women are making these mats, there are different types of mats. There's a type called keret, and when they're making them, they sing this particular type of work song, and it's very interesting because it has a very long line. And this is an example of well, I've got an audio example. This is from YouTube of some women performing the work song when they're actually making these mats. What they're making here really is just very small, and if women are making the mats, you can see from this photograph they're actually quite a bit bigger. But this is the Hestikabedda.
حريق مريباي الله بالسحل كيت قاريي حبستاي كبدي حريق مريباي الله بالسحل كيت قاريي عبادي تلبي حنبارتي الله بالسحل كيت قاريي حبستاي كبدي حريق مريباي.
So that's the Hestikabedda, and I often mention actually because this is the longest line really in Somali poetry. Each of those like ged baged ka uder lagagaraye galo more mulahdi, each it's difficult to know whether it's a line or it's in the sense of verse made up of different lines, but if it is, then each line has a different metrical pattern. It's one of the most complex it's the most sort of complex metrical pattern that I've come across in Somali. These examples of work songs are examples of what might be called heshiddet, sort of traditional songs, and we don't know who first made up these poems, these songs, who first made the words. Somebody did do that at some time in the past, but we don't know who it was. But if we think of Manso poetry, this is another category of poetry, then we do know who made the words. And this distinction is quite, it's in certain ways it's sort of simple, in other ways it's sort of more complex, and I don't have the time to go into it in detail. But the Manso poetry, one of the lines that is the most prestigious is one called Gabe. And you see on the screen now an example of a Gabe poem. And these traditionally were recited to what's called in Somali Luk. And the Luk for the gabe, in the same way as the work songs, it's a musical mode of performing the poetry. But when somebody is reciting a poem of this form, they always say who made the poem, and they cannot change the words. With the work songs, you could maybe change the words, and we don't know who first made up those words. But with the gabe, it's different. And I mean, Ali was just talking about politics, and the in a sense, one of the most important historic sources of history of Somali history are the poems that have been made for as long as we know. Which, I mean, we only can really go back to the late 19th century. The people like Said Muhammad Abul Hassan and Ghumman Bulhan and all these great poets of the early 20th century, their poems, because of this concept that they cannot be changed, means that we can be confident that really what we have now are the words that they spoke. Sometimes one comes across some variation, but I won't go into that. But this, I'm going to just play you this now with the gabe look. So this is what it sounds like, and this is a traditional way of performing this form of poetry musically.
Dor ano laga jojiyayo yara dhanaanaade ninda dhamiye wa garanaya dhulayqa bojane dera quraiyo bilbay darata hawde ayadoo dhimbishe sudiyo dhilatay maygaga ayadoo dhammaan wada rintayoo dhadano
So I just noticed a spelling mistake there, sorry. Waye. So that's the gabe. Now, again, musically, this is what's called a suspended pentatonic scale. So if you know about music, then you can see the details there. I've written that in because it's actually interesting musically in the sense that the next example I'm going to play, or one of the next examples, just quickly, this one is actually in the same scale. So that, although this, in fact, I'm going to change slightly. I'll just quickly play you this. This is an example of a song from the 1970s, and it uses the same tonal structure. So it's got the same musical scale as that gabe look that we just heard. But this is a modern song from the 1970s. And it's this is a love song. And this is just part of this love song, which is in the form of a dialogue between the man and the woman. And this is the second part of it, in which the woman speaks to the man and describes him as a horse. You have the translation is not line by line. This is a part of it. I've translated this whole poem. It's been published. But I'll just play you this as an example of modern music using the kaman, the oud, the lute. And I'll come back quickly to the development of the music that you're about to hear. Sorry, whenever I touch that, the other thing goes out. So, okay, well, that just gives you a sense of what that sounds like. Now, this that style of music, this is an absolutely wonderful poem by Hassan Haji Abdullah Hassan Geni, who is the father of Abdullah Hassan Geni, who we heard just earlier on. And it's frankly one of the most beautiful poems in any language that I know of. It's very popular amongst the Somalis, and it actually was part of a play that he made in the late 70s to do with the war between Ethiopia and Somalia of 77 to 78. But I've not come across the play, but this song from it is well remembered. And the instrument that you heard there is the oud, the lute. In Somali, it's called kaman. And the person who really developed that musical style, there were a number of people, but the one who's generally is seen as the father of the oud music is Abdullah Qarshi, who died in 1997, lived 1924 to 97. This is a picture of him when he was a young man, and this was when he was older. And he was fundamental to the development of modern Somali music in the sense that it's interesting because his life story, he didn't grow up in the Somali territories. He was actually born in what's now Tanzania, in Arusha. He moved to Leiden when he was young. And Leiden, which was just opposite what was then British Somaliland, there were many Somalis living there. There's always been close relations and links between the Somali Horn and Leiden and other parts of Yemen. And he would hear songs in Swahili, he'd heard them in Arabic and in sort of Indian languages, so Indian songs, English songs. When he heard Somali, I think he heard Swahili. I can't remember if he mentioned Swahili songs, hearing those in Leiden. But when he heard Somali, he heard these poetry sort of intoned in the way that we heard before with the gabe, this sort of was this sort of more, what to him sounded less like a song, even though it is musical and it has its own attractiveness. So he developed, as it were, a style of playing the oud for Somali music. And here we have, these are the details of what I'm about to play. This is him. This was recorded in 1985 in Mogadishu by Francesco Giannattasio, an ethnomusicologist here in Italy. And the words can actually be found in this book, Poesia Orale Soma, la storia di una nazione. So the details are there. And I'll just play you this extract here. So this is Abdullah Qarshi playing the kaman, and some other musicians, I don't know their names, they were apparently from the National Theatre of Mogadishu. Sorry to keep cutting these out, but there are details on this PowerPoint. So as this is recorded, if you would like to sort of look at it again, you'll be able to find the there's the information to find the sources of all of the things that I'm playing are publicly available apart from the first work song. So that style of playing the oud developed into what we just heard here with Hassan Geni's poem in the 1970s. The player in that was actually Daoud Ali Matzaf, who was also the composer of the tune that went with that particular song. Another key figure who requires a whole lecture in its own right is Abdulkarim Farah Kir, who is still alive and is still making, composing music. He made, I think somebody's microphone is open. Now he made the music to a very famous song, Beled Wain. Sorry, somebody's microphone is open, I can hear you. Right, so Beled Wain is a famous poem by Hadrawi, who's still alive and is one of the greatest living Somali poets. Can people make sure the microphone is muted? I think Henk Marcus is, and sorry to make your name, but just if we can, thank you. So
yes, I also informed. Thank you.
Right,
okay.
Thanks. Yeah. So so now Beled Wain, one of the key things of this particular song is that the tune in it changes. There's not the time to play the whole song or even just a part of it. It goes on for well over 10 minutes, and it's a love poem. And in each time, the tone of the poem changes, and it moves from one sort of section to another. What Abdulkarim did, he, in a sense, changed. Well, not in a sense, he did change the melody and allowed the music to follow the different parts of the words. And this was something very innovative. And I'm just going to finish off really with, there's in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a lot of, I mean, even previously and still today, influence from other musical traditions around the world. There is this collection, Sweet as Broken Dates. And if I just very quickly play a little bit of this, because this is the wonderful Faduma Qasim, who sadly died a few years ago. She did certainly, she sang, she knew Swahili and Arabic and songs and Somali. She was Somali, and this is her with the Sharero band singing a song, Qais wa Layla, Qaisi wa Layla in Somali. On YouTube, Qaisi wa Layla, as Romeo and Juliet, and going through all of that is not, it's the sort of equivalent of Romeo and Juliet, but in Arabic, in Somali. But so you can find that on YouTube, and you can hear there that there is a lot of it. There's influence from sort of soul music and from reggae and other styles. And this has continued. I mean, there are young Somali musicians making hip hop music and rap. The Wayah Ursub, Falis Abdi, for example, very famous for some of their songs in that style. And I just want to finish with this is sort of very up to date. This is a song that shows, this is a traditional form called Danto. And this has become, in the last few years, it's become very popular, particularly in Jijjiga and the Ethiopian areas of the Somali territories, and I mean throughout the Somali-speaking world. And this is one which by a famous singer, Ahmed Budul, who composed the words and the music in Danto. And it's about the coronavirus. And this was made, you'll see from the video, actually, I think it was the United Nations, and to get the message out about looking after oneself in this current situation we all find ourselves in.
فهم كل شوي أفوده هاي سنينا ورنحا في مهدون كفائدين فيكر واجبا لين وذا فري فهم كل شوي أفوده هاي سنينا كفرينتي ساو فارور ياهي سهرانتو كفارال طاعي فرح روحكو ويمتها وفي دين قعماها فولحا في ماد كفرينتي ساو فارور ياهي سهرانتو كفارال طاعي فرح روحكو ويمتها وفي دين قعماها.
There again, that's on YouTube. You can find that, and it's just the translation of the first sort of three sort of parts. But this is this, in a sense, this sort of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. With this is not from a work song, but from a traditional sort of dance form, the danto, which is related to other dance forms, wiglo and hirwo. And the metrical pattern of this line is one which is sort of particular to that. Yep, so there we are. That's a very, very quick, brief overview of Somali music. I hope that's given you some little insight into what is a very rich tradition, which is actually very little known outside of the Somali world. I mean, people may have heard of Kainan, and there are, I mean, people like Mariam Mursal, and has made, for example, a CD that came out in one of the labels in the UK. But it's relatively little known, but there's some actually wonderful music, and a lot of this is available on YouTube. So I'd recommend everyone to go and listen to all these wonderful songs. So Wad Mahatsantin. Salam.
Shukran, Buana Martin Owen. Thank you. Fascinating. I noted already, Faiza from our audience, she wrote down a question for you. I also saved it, and probably we can react to that and other possible questions later on, if that's fine with you. But thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And now, as announced at the beginning, we continue, and I'd like to introduce to you the third talk as part of our first panel, given by Dr. Jama Musejama, who holds an exciting background in computational linguistics of African languages. Dr. Jama is the founder of the Agasia International Book Fair and the director of the Agasia Cultural Center in Somaliland. It's a great pleasure and honor having you with us today, needless to say that. And I give the digital floor to you for a talk titled The Soundscape Archive in Somaliland, SAS, Revival of an Otherwise Endangered Intangible Heritage. Thank you, Dr. Jama. We can't hear you. Jama, can you hear me? We can't hear you, or is that only me?
I think, are you hearing me now?
Yes, now I can hear you well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm trying to share with my screen, but while I'm doing, I want to thank the organizers of this long-awaited and wonderful event that finally took place. And it's both real pleasure and honor to share, this panel with Professor Ali Jemale and Professor Martin Owen, Ali and Martin. Laba qofan sahibnahay both branches and someone whom I respect in the field. So thank you for having me, and it's a real pleasure. Initially, I was a little bit worried following what wonderful presentations that the two scholars have done, but then thinking of what I am sharing with you as a kind of, how I can say, an appendix of what they have said. And it really makes sense that I'm speaking after Ali and Martin, because of the few minutes that I have. What I wanted to share is this kind of unusual archive that we have here in Somaliland and here in Hargeisa Cultural Center, which when people think that the heritage that we are losing because of all things that were happening in this world, because of the war, because of the time that's changing, people think that the tangible heritage is the thing that we are losing and immediately visible because of its visible. But the reality is that we are losing another huge, important, intangible this time heritage that needs to be put in the list of the endangered heritage of the Somali people. And the fact that Martin mentioned it, Sweet is a spoken date. If you read that title, there is a subtitle which says Lost Somali Tales. That's I think the last, if I'm not wrong, album, and for the last, I would say, decade, album produced outside in Somaliland, Somalia, and produced in worldwide on Somali music. And the fact that it has a subtitle Lost Somali Tales is the things that I'm talking about, because of that album came from the Hargeisa Cultural Center archive, the soundscape archive that I am talking about today. So it's a sort of my conclusion. What I wanted to say is what I want, what I have to start to continue what Martin was saying about how important is to preserve this heritage. But probably the word preserve gives me the sense of taking it to the museum, which I translate also killing it if we are putting in the unparking and putting in the museum. The meaning, the main reason of the Soundscape archive is to put again revival, to put it in circulation. And unfortunately, the music is one of those for several reasons. It's not only because of, we will be talking about analog cassettes that are expiring because of the technology outdated, but also because of there is someone who's promoting that the music is not something good. The music is haram, the music is sin. So there is also a campaign against music. And if that is not put in circulation again, and give an opportunity that the music to be produced, to be offered a platform that young people can produce music, we will definitely lose, and this time for good, because it's not only the cassettes that you can transfer in a digital, so you preserve, but the revival and the continuation and the production of that art, important art for Somali people, otherwise will be lost. So what I'll be talking about quickly is to tell you about what the soundscape is and some figures. So to start with, let us say, this image is basically, for those who ever visited the Hargeisa Cultural Center, is those physical cassettes that we have. And they are the small cassette, the analog cassette that was very popular in early 70s, but also we have the old tapes in 40s and 50s produced in Radio Hargeisa, Radio Mogadishu, Radio Djibouti, and later these cassettes produced at basically sometimes in underground. And I give you some figures. We have over 14,000 cassettes of those analog cassettes at the moment. We started with a small amount, 3,500 cassettes that we buy. And remember, from an old music shop closed in Djibouti. And then announcing that the Cultural Center was collecting these cassettes, people started to donate, including Martin Owen. I'm thanking for the donation. He did his small but important collection that he contributed. So they came back from London back to Hargeisa, and so people started to donate these cassettes. So we have 14,000 cassettes, and it's almost 17,000 hours of audio. Now, most of them is music, starting from the first in 40s and 50s, and then Radio Hargeisa and so on. But they are also oral poetry. There are entire collection of poetry, underground poetry produced in Mogadishu, for example, under the military regime that didn't allow that people circulated the poetry, and people recorded on those cassettes and then circulated through these cassettes. But you find also interesting cassettes like people a mother who is sending her son who is outside of the country, instead of writing a letter, recording her voice and sending to this diaspora, these people who are outside of the country. So these kind of unique voices, emotions, music, of course, oral poetry, but also radio programs. You will find Musa Ismail Galal, who is talking about how important is literature, what we are talking today here, or how important is astronomy, traditional astronomy, a radio program that you will find in those cassettes. So important cassettes in that sense, important archive that if we don't transfer today, and luckily we have digitalized 20% of these cassettes, and we will continue and produce a digital version of this important cassette. So that's what Soundscape Project Archive is. Now, it is always linked to the Hargeisa International Book Fair. And Akara was mentioned, even the books that were coming in 2019 Hargeisa International Book Fair, when colleagues came here to collect some of those literary production. And this project also linked to the Hargeisa International Book Fair because it is the first place where we introduced how important the audio museum, where people can go through the Hargeisa Cultural Center, touch a button, and then hear the sound of an animal, or the sound how, for example, in the pastoral, how people use the whistling to communicate with the camels, for instance, which is unfortunately today is rarely you would find. So that's where we started. And the Hargeisa Cultural Center, as some of the people who are connected here know, is a place where we are trying to to use art and culture and literature as building blocks of a society. Because of, unfortunately, in the case of Somaliland, when you are coming from a post-conflict society, you give a priority that, in a different way. You consider how important is security, safety, infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools. And when you come to talk about art and culture, you finish everything that you have. So you are losing one of the most important things that the humanity has. I always said we are losing what makes the human being humane if we forget art. If we got art and culture that the society used to have. But when you are coming this situation, the priority comes in another aspect. So you create a vacuum, and those vacuums are so sensitive. And in the case of the music, the vacuum that we have created, avoiding and not having a home for art and culture, is the fact that created we lose the young people who are growing in Somaliland, for example, who don't know anything about the music that existed in 1940s. Luckily, YouTube, social media, TikTok, and so on help it. And this is a kind of, I think social media, born for Somali people when it comes to the art and music. So the Hargeisa Cultural Center is a kind of a place where we are giving access to the art and culture and music, I underline, as a fundamental human right for the young people. If we lose that fundamental human right as access, then we will lose for good this art, this endangered heritage that I'm talking about. So basically the traditional historic cultural identity, which is the sound, is fading, and it is in a high risk of loss. And the aim is to collect these melodies, and they are not only music, but they are also natural sound created, man-made, but also natural sounds, which could be a traditional, for example, sitar, traditional celebratory sound. Women used to have brambur, but also they had in a wedding celebrations or religious gathering a sitar, which today it's rare to see for many reasons. So we need to protect it. We need to put it back again in circulation in the life. It could be just clapping that accompanies in the Somali traditional and regional folk dances. These sounds might not be because of the music, because of the progress that the music actually is making, we might lose for good. So we need to document. It could be sound made by to communicate, as I was saying, with camels or livestock, be it direct them to, for watering or for running quicker and so on. This different of whistling is something that we are completely losing. It could be the sound of adhan calling in the salat, where totally became an Arabized version of, so you lose the real, what I would use the Somali way of prayer calls, which has another sound that today we are losing because of it is not anymore common. If we don't document today, we might lose for good. It could be music melodies in the past, and the krami, the entire someone has the microphone. The krami, the collection of krami music that today no one is playing live music, but everyone is recording and using with a computer. We want to go back and first of all present to the young people so they can emulate and continue playing live music. It could be the sound of a nature. The climate change is affecting this intangible heritage. The climate change is affecting in the nomadic area, in the pastures, and the sounds that the wind used to create is not anymore around. So we need to document all those music, sound, audio. Some of them are recorded now just to expand the archive. But most importantly, it is from the past. So that's what the soundscape elements is that we are calling. It could be historical speech, be it political, social, engagement, or just typical poetry, recited and disappearing. Now I want to conclude with why all these elements are so fundamental and timely today. It is a way, of course, to create a space for art and culture because of it doesn't have a home. Art and culture, music, theater has no home today in the Horn of Africa or Somali inhabited areas, but most importantly, Hargeisa, who used to have one of the most beautiful theaters, today it doesn't have one. Used to have two wonderful cinemas, and today it doesn't have one. We have to create space again and real a physical space that can host the art and culture. So to create and give an enabling environment to unlock again, using the old music and old archive to unlock the potential talent that we have today. Of course, it's to give, as I was saying, art and culture home, theater, music, production studio, and most importantly, create this space and introduce into the areas where today there is no space. I want to thank, but before I close, I want to, if you have this sound, just give you a sense of the kind of elements that I don't know if you are hearing me.
Gama, are you playing this?
Yeah, I'm just playing. Now, this is the kind of unique walk songs that people use it when they are doing the hard work. Now we know because of from the nomadic side, when we are watering and giving water camels, there were well-known, or the example that Martin gave, it's a well-known when women are making kebed or aus or other stuff in the Somali hut. But this is a kind of a unique, different urbanized version of the song work where people who are working in the port, when they are unloading, they use it. And so they invented a kind of a continuation of the work song from the nomadic, but urbanized it because of they are in the port of Berbera and they are unloading from the ship. So this continuation will be lost if we don't document today and put back among the young people so they can have it again. Thank you, Anna.
Our library's latest acquisition trip was conducted to the just mentioned Hargeisa International Book Fair in 2019. And in that sense, the library owes a lot to Dr. Jama Musa. Thank you. As Professor Ali just mentioned, Somali literature is written and distributed in a particular social space, and that space is fraught with different discourses. I will show 3 different examples of books in this living context, and how libraries, in my opinion, can enhance the visibility of these environments. The first one is an educational context. As we've heard today, Somali literature is very much part of a vibrant culture, but it's also part of a formal school system. And this is not a single system, but it's
Can't hear you.
You muted yourself, John.
Sorry. Better so?
Yes.
Okay. So this is not a single system, but it exists side by side with other educational systems. I realized by walking around one of Hargeisa's bookshops in 2019 that apart from the Somaliland curriculum, so also at least 3 different curricula exist. So there's the East African syllabus, mainly coming from Kenya, but there's also the British-based GCSE and a curriculum from the Gulf states, which is used for particular subjects. Now these curricula, they are not value-free. They're not value-free because a national curriculum is always tied to a larger political program, a particular world vision, or serving the development of the nation state as mentioned in this particular syllabus. By just picking one or two books from a catalog is not doing justice to this plurality in a natural habitat. To address this omission, we are currently in discussion with the world's largest textbook database in Germany in order to make the African educational material in our catalog more accessible. And that is one of the tangible results from these acquisition trips. Now, a second context has to do with the geography. During our acquisition trips, we often wonder what is not for sale. In one of the Islamic bookshops, I bought a local print in Arabic of Safinatu Najah, the ship of salvation. This is one of the most common Islamic primers on ritual prayer in the Indian Ocean. Now, it's not striking that we found the book in Hargeisa. In the existence of this particular book in Somaliland, in a cheap print edition, in an area dominated by the Shafi'i school of law, as in other places of the Indian Ocean, you see the East African coast all the way to Indonesia. So that's not striking. It illustrates how ideas and legal texts are traveling in the Indian Ocean. But what is striking is that I couldn't find a Somali translation of this book. Our catalogue alone in Leiden shows an abundance of vernacular translation of this particular booklet. For example, we have Urdu versions, and this one is from a Javanese language. And that shows that the book is widely being used all over the Indian Ocean. But apparently no Somali translation existed in Hargeisa, at least in 2019. Although I did find a translation of another simple Arabic grammar book, like An-Nahu al-Wadih. The final third context I would like to illustrate, that books are common are economic commodities. They are sold and distributed in a lively social economic context. So we try to upload as many pictures of this context in the public domain, illustrating, for example, the currency, the particular price of the books, the interior of shops, and versions of typescripts that never made it into a real book. On the right-hand side, you see a dummy which was offered to a bookseller, but it was later published with another title and cover. So the Somali book on our shelf is not produced in a vacuum, but it's an artifact which comes with a history, a provenance, and a lively context. And as a library, we face the challenge to draw attention to this particular context. Thank you.
So Gerard, that was your part?
Yes, that's my part.
Thank you very much. Good to hear this, and to now we continue with Yasmin, or
Jos has to complete their talk, right? Jos, who was alleged to present before. Jos, are you there? Can you try to share also your screen?
Yes, I tried to share my screen.
Otherwise, I have it as well, you know, so without stress.
There, it should be there now. Is it visible?
Not yet.
No,
not
it's
yet.
not. I can allow me, please, to share. Would you like that? Yes.
I would love to
Right.
to see that. Thank you.
Can you see?
So what I will talk about is about the Somali language books in Leiden and give it some broader context. We in Leiden have a library of about 100,000 books, and we love books, of course. We love books from Africa, and we want to know the knowledge from Africa, and we want to share the knowledge from Africa via our library. And we noticed that we had a much too one-sided view on Africa. So what we are trying to do now is to go on book trips to Africa, buy books there. We try to reconsider our collection policy and to have more open access so that anyone will be able to look at the books that we have. Therefore, are my slides visible now?
Can you see them too, though?
Yes.
Can you
Yes,
see
they are
them?
visible.
Visible, okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
So I would now like to go to the slide that tells more about the acquisition trips from the ASC library.
Yes, here we are, yes.
We have been holding acquisition trips since the 80s, but since I came to the library, I made it explicit that we would like to have an acquisition trip to an African country every year, thereby buying books on the book fairs, which makes sure that you will have at least a few hundred books at the same time. So we went to Nigeria in 2016, Burkina Faso in 2017, and to Morocco and Botswana in 2018. And in 2019, Gerard van der Bruinhorst had a brilliant idea to go to Somaliland, which was terra incognita for me. And he said if we would go to the 12th Hargeisa International Book Fair, we would be able to have at least a few hundred books and bring them to Leiden. So he went there, bought 500 books, of which 14% were in Arabic, about 10% in English, and 75% was in Somali, which was of course nice, but now we needed to make it work. Could you go to the next slide, please? So what we try to do is 4 things. And with these 4 things, try to bring the Somali collection into the world. The first thing that we did was making a web dossier on Somali literature with the ASC library staff. Anna Kayara Araya was so kind to write an introduction, and we made selected titles and had links with web resources. The web dossier can still be consulted. The second thing that we did was making abstracts of the book, because it's nice to have these books, but it's even more nice to know what it is about, so people can get a fair and quick chance to see that this book, for instance, was about Somali poets. Next slide, please. The third thing that we helped to organize was the Somali Day, with which we tried to bring the Somali literature in a broader context. And it's fun to see how it works. The fourth thing that we did was to make description of the Somali books available in Wikidata, and via Wikidata into other platforms that might not be important for regular people, but it makes the data on these books broader available, and people could easily see that, for instance, this version of this book was online available in the repository of Northern Africa Center in Uppsala. Ursula Oberst will tell you more about the Wikidata things that we did in a few minutes. In this last slide, you can see a few examples of the books, and I'd like you to notice the one on the left down, which is a translation of Animal Farm by George Orwell. I think it's important to give these Somali books a broader context and have them out in the open and advertise them to the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jos. Great. It's good to see that the collection is rapidly expanding and making available this relatively new tradition for most readers in Holland and Europe available. And also the links to Wikidata, I think is an excellent idea. So I think we Ursula? Yes.
Mute. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I think you can all see my screen now, hopefully.
Yes.
And you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. As Jos explained before, the ASCL library seeks to increase the visibility of its collection and to reach more potential users via the web, search engines, and international networks based on modern web technologies such as Wikidata. What is Wikidata? Wikidata is a free and open knowledge base that can be read and edited by both humans and machines. Wikidata acts as central storage for the structured data of its Wikimedia sister projects, including Wikipedia. Beyond Wikimedia projects, Wikidata also provides support to many other sites and services, including the Google Knowledge Graph. On the screen on the left-hand side, you can see an example of a Somali publication in Wikidata and its representation in a Google Knowledge Graph. But Wikidata is also a community of volunteers who update and maintain Wikidata together. The African Studies Center edited the metadata of its Somali collection to Wikidata, and in no time, the metadata records have been completed, for example, with a Dutch description and a set of unique identifiers of other databases, such as the Internet Archive and Goodreads. These unique identifiers actually enable connections between databases and collections of information. The African Studies Center Library contributes to Wikidata to broaden public outreach and visibility, but we also contribute in order to increase the coverage of Africa in Wikimedia projects. Research on the topical coverage within Wikimedia projects by, among others, the Oxford Internet Institute revealed that Wikimedia projects are highly uneven and driven by the interests of its editors' community. You can find detailed information in Wikipedia on Napoleon and his horse Marengo, on the Dutch national football team, on the German-Netherlands football rivalry, but the information on Africa is sparse and often out of date. With the upload of the Somali collection to Wikidata, the ASCL library contributed to counteract this imbalance, albeit on a modest scale. Before the inclusion of the Somali collection in Wikidata, Wiki's knowledge base contained 4 publications in Somali, all published by the Welsh government and about the Welsh society, such as a flyer on the Welsh Eye Care initiative. Now Wikidata contains more than 300 publications in Somali and about Somali topics. The huge data set, in combination with the technology behind Wikidata, makes it possible to query Wikidata and to present research results visually. To conclude, I would like to show 2 examples. I will leave my PowerPoint presentation. I will switch to the Wikidata query service, and what you see on the screen, in fact, is a research result from a Wikidata query. It depicts the place of publications for all Somali editions in Wikidata in form of a bubble chart. And you can see here the green bubble, Cardiff, that indicates the 4 Welsh government publications. All other bubbles represent publications in the ASCL collection. This chart shows that quite a number of Somali publications in the ASCL collections were published in Sweden. As you can see, Stockholm being present as place of publication, as well as Uppsala and some smaller Swedish towns. in order to query Wikidata, one has to know its query language. So as I said, this is a query result. If I scroll up to the top of the page, you see probably this little bit scaring query language. But the good news is that there are also tools one can use to retrieve information on Wikidata without using this query languages. And one of these tools is Scholia. And we just have a little quick look at Scholia.
Sorry, Ursula, you have 2 minutes more. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I'm finished in 2 minutes.
Okay, fine.
Don't worry.
Okay.
Okay, now we are looking at Scholia, and Scholia is a tool that creates visual scholarly profiles for topics, peoples, organizations, using the bibliographic and other information in Wikidata. And I looked up the keyword Somali literature, and now I will be presented all publications in Wikidata which are indexed with the keyword Somali literature, and I will be presented different kinds of visualizations which contain different kinds of informations. I just want to have a private look at these visualizations. So you can, for example, see in a table the most recently published works on Somali literature in Wikidata. You can see in which year most of the publications were published. You can see the earliest published works on the topic. And you can see also what I think is very nice, the authors who published about the topic, and among them all 3 keynote speakers. And you can also see the topics which co-occur with the topic Somali literature in form of a table and also in form of a graph. And speaking about topics, I want to thank you for your attention, and I will now hand over to Yasmin, who will elaborate on the topics of the entire Somali collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin Noor. Last year, I worked on writing the abstracts for the Somali collection here at the library. It was a very fun process, and while working on the books, I realized that, or I noticed that a lot of the books discuss topics that Somalis also discuss a lot in everyday life. In that case, we can think of the things you hear on Somali TV, or the things you see on Somali social media, or when you go to a gathering at a community center, for example. There were 5 recurring themes I would like to talk about. The first theme is migration to Europe, known by Somalis as Tahrib. So the books that deal with this theme consist of books that are based on true stories of people who went to Europe, but also fictional stories, both with the aim of making this problem debatable, but also in order to find out what causes people to migrate to Europe and how this can be prevented. I've included a cartoon on this slide by a famous Somali cartoonist called Amin Amir. So you can see 2 old men standing on the right. The one with the blue shirt is telling the other one, so he's describing the situation of the people who are the family who are on the ground. And he's pointing out that this is family Muda, who sold their house in order so that their son could migrate to Europe, and he died on the way. And the other guy who is wearing the green shirt responds with Wardibato, Wilaan, Yuguri Laan, Allah Badbadi Umatan. This is a loss, to be without a son and to be without a house. May God save these people. So this cartoon shows that not only in literature, these topics are important, but also outside of it. Then we have the second theme, which is marriage. The books can be divided into books that are about getting married, and this is discussed from a cultural and an Islamic perspective. Then we have the books that are about how one can have a successful marriage. Remarkably, most of these books are the ones that are about how one can have a successful marriage are written by men, which in itself obviously is not a problem, but sometimes it can feel like you're reading a handbook on how you can become the author's dream wife instead of how you can have a successful marriage. On this slide, I've also included a picture that is on which you can see a program that is currently being broadcasted on Somali television on a weekly basis, I think, in which topics are discussed by different sections of society. And during this episode, the question that was being discussed is, so what does Somali culture say about a husband helping his wife? Again, this shows that these topics are keeping people busy. Then we have the third theme, which is politics. These books are mainly about Somali conflicts and the aftermath of the Somali Civil War. In that case, we can think of books that are written on the conflict with Ethiopia, books that are about the stories of people who have fled the country after the Civil War broke out in 1991, but also books that discuss the aftermath, so clanism, what causes a state to collapse, and also there are also some books that discuss the lives of important Somali political figures. Then we have the fourth theme, which is religion. These books consist of questions and answers on these questions by religious scholars. Then we have books that discuss specific topics such as Islamic banking, or the interpretation of dreams. There are some books that are about Islamic history, and I think I came across two books that are about religious Somali poetry, specifically Sufi poetry. And then we have the last theme, which is culture. There are a lot of books that are about poetry and the poems of well-known Somali poets, such as Hadrawi, Samatar Bahnan. Then we have books that are on traditional Somali folk dances, books on the history of written Somali, the grammar of Somali language. We have books, we have Somali stories, and also books that discuss Somali proverbs.
Okay, thank you, Yasmin. Thank you very much. I would like to ask you to reserve your questions until after the next presentation by Professor Ali Jamale. Could I invite you, Ali?
Yes, yes, Professor Abing.
So, go ahead.
No, but in fact, Professor, Anna Chiara who will help me. I'm a Luddite, you see.
Yes, I'm there. Can you all see?
Yes,
Ali?
yes.
All right.
Yes, and in a way, really, because we don't really have that much time, and so much has been said by actually Gerard and Yasmin and Jos and Ursula. things that I would have sort of really said, so I won't really go back to them. What I'll talk about in terms of the Latin publishers, it's kind of really strange, and Ursula mentioned this. There is something about Sweden that I don't really understand, whether it is, there is that infrastructure that always helps people from the Horn of Africa. One of the earliest, for example, publishers was by a group of Eritreans, Admas. And then there was the Scansum press by Muhammad Sheikh Hassan, and then Yusuf Sheikh Abdullahi, Haj Abdullahi, I would say, and now we have Latin. And Latin, basically, it's kind of really, again, there's something about this Swedish sort of culture that I really, it needs to be sort of researched in a way at some point. But what you really find is there is a community college, for example, run by Mustafa and Abdullah Haji and their group. One of the best associations for Somali teachers is in Sweden, run by Gabo and Dr. Jaita. There is something in Sweden. And there is the only bookstore that you find perhaps in Europe, which also in Sweden, Shabelle Books, run by Ahmed Noor. Now, in the case of Latin, this is a collective, really, a writer's collective, basically. It's different in the sense that, for example, Skansen, that's owned by Muhammad Hassan, or even in the case of the new publishing company in Cairo, Hill Press, for example, or Law Press in London, for example. This is really different in the sense that it's a collective. And it's a collective that was basically, it started in 2017, and it publishes 4 to 6 books. And the books actually are read by at least 3 external reviewers before they publish the books. It's read by 3 people. And at times, if the writer could not even come up with what is called the subvention to help in the production of the book, it is the writers collective that helps them and then sell their books, etc., etc. So there, see, Professor Anna Chiara, you started with me. And the Somalis say, if you are talking about, if you are the host, in a way they say, talking about myself, you sort of really talk last about yourself and about your books. But here, of course, there is this novel that I wrote, Gasso Ganun Gasim, which literally kind of really means a tentative title that is Kral Milk Sustenance. And the novel, for whatever reason, has garnered a very generous, really, very generous reviews from Somali scholars, basically. And it was seen as a novel that heralds a new form of storytelling, as they said, not seen before. Yes, Professor Anna Chiara?
Next slide, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
There is, I am translating the novel into English now. And this is an extract from my forthcoming sort of, and if you remember when I talked about in the keynote speech, I mentioned of Ali the Honest, that young kid who was in a way molested by his stepmother. And here I appropriate the story that was told to me by my father. And in a way, as you can see, I don't really want to read everything, but it says, crestfallen, the soothsayer mumbled to herself. Who advises you? It was said that the orphan's late mother came from a distant, remote place. And they could sort of really agree where that place was, basically. So reminiscing the last paragraph about the past, the soothsayer felt goosebumps all over her body. Shivering, she clenched her teeth. She then began to whimper and mumble. Dazed, she looked to the side and then covered her mouth with the palm of her right hand. Professor Anikiara. Now we come to the real books. And Leiden by Bashir Muhammad Hirsi is the firstborn, actually, of Lashin printers. This is a book that, roughly translated, is predictions, conjectures in a way, and it deals with the socio-political life in Somalia, but it also really critically captures the Somali culture and its strength. The next book was Noloshi Silonet, which is basically about a novel that deals with a young man who goes through extreme privation. Now, that book is written by Abdurrahim Galer. And there is one thing that I have to say in terms of Bashir and Galer, they are the ones who founded a website called Lashin, and it was a literary website, no politics, and it's still in existence. And Lashin Publishers really takes the name after them. It was their idea. It was really, it goes back to them. Professor Anikiara. The next book is written by Hussein Muhammad Abdullah Wadad, who is the chair of the collective now, and it's called Godob Ya Galad. And this book, actually, if you read Dutch, you will find it in Guy Gillen's. There's a newspaper called GD, and you can find it in that periodical. The next was Pidami, which is really very important also in the sense that this is a book about language and grammar, etc. But it teaches grammar and language through storytelling and poetry. Next, Professor. The next one is Gal and Gayan by Hassan Abdullah Alasso Shirbal, who's really a poet and who's also, we don't want to become bureaucrats, but he's the Director General of the publisher of Lashin. And it's a richly latticed novel that brilliantly captures forms of courtship practiced in the Somali peninsula some 200 years ago. It's a fascinating book. The next one is Kaimado by Abdullahi Ma'alin Mahmoud, who lives in Saudi Arabia. And it's a novel, really, the first one that I know of that deals with a long drought, a drought that was called Dabader in the 1970s. Next, Professor. And then we come to Wayihi Warsame that I talked about. So I'm not going to really go back to the Wayihi Warsame. Even Warsame by Warsame Ahmed and Amalle. And then you have, this is also a novel that deals with young shepherds and their ways of courting that most of the times really leads to marriage. And then Garbadud by Abdurrahim Galer that I already talked about, Abdurrahim's first novel, and he and Bashir are the founders of Lashin to begin with. Next, Professor. The next one is by a well-known Georgy Kapchits that you all know, a Russian paremologist. And this is his book. And it was really an honor for the printers, the publishers, to print this one. This is basically a modern dictionary of Somali proverbs by that veteran Somali scholar. The next one is Murtikal by Saeed Abdi Awale. And this is a unique book. This is really interesting in the sense that here you have a writer who creates, composes his own proverbs and his own stories. And the proverbs and other adages in the book are all alliterated in the letters B and Y. These are his own creations. Next, Professor. The next one is Jamashada Hawenka. I haven't read this book. I have to really be honest. So what I did was I translated whatever was sent to me, but that too kind of seems strange to me, that the book will be detailing the great cravings of women during pregnancy. And this is a male author after all, but perhaps he has done some research into this, or perhaps this is a novel that somehow we mistranslated. This last one is Sirta Gusha, The Secrets to Success, by none other than Hassan Mugani. People have been talking all day today, Jama, Muhammad Barre, myself, about the Bararug Library. This is a digital library, the like of which has never been seen in Somalia. This is really an innovation. And in that sense, it is basically a comprehensive guide and offers advice to readers, etc., etc. Next, Professor. And then you have Gudabo Yagarnakhsi by Abdullah Qasim Dami. And this is a book that delves into the poetry of a leading poet and a towering intellectual, the late Saeed Dami. I think that is it, probably, Professor. Let me just conclude basically the importance of this. In a way, what Gerard, Yasmin, Joss, Ursula did. To me, really, that was, I attended a lecture by a Somali artist and thinker, Amal Olhag, is that how you say? A-L-H-A-A-G, Amal Olhag. And there she talked about something that was really important. What was etched in my brain in a way really, was how we commemorate things, she said, but they are not really embodied. And what you guys at Leiden University, Professor Abing, Professor Anna Chiara, and all the things that you have done, you are not only commemorating, but you are embodying them. And for that, I thank you.